You have disgusting, decrepit old gauges that look like this, and you want to update them to look absolutely awesome? Then stay tuned for this episode of Dentside Depot as we install Dakota Digital's brand new RTX gauges in a 79 Ford. If you're worried about how difficult it is to install Dakota Digital gauges, don't need to be, because today we're going to get you through this installation in about 8 minutes. I've already done most of the work here, so this is going to be an explanation only video, and I will show you it's not as hard as you think. Okay, now you can see our Project Ford truck today obviously has a Cummins 12-valve engine in it, but the process here for step one is going to be the same for anything. You are going to install your temperature gauge, which you can see right here, and you're also going to install your oil gauge, which I have on my block down here underneath, which is kind of difficult to see. Now, Dakota Digital is going to include some adapters, all right? And it's going to be pretty easy at this step to figure out where you want to put these and how to install them. So for the Ford engines, you're going to want to install the temperature sensor up at the front, most likely in the thermostat housing. Use the provided adapters, put Teflon tape on the bottom adapter, and then the coolant sensor itself doesn't need any Teflon tape on it, although I usually put some on just to be safe. Install that adapter and then find somewhere to route it through the firewall. And that's exactly what I've done with my temperature sensor here on the back of my engine. The oil pressure sensor is going to be the same way. You want to decide where you want to locate your oil pressure sensor. You can see mine is right there. Find the correct and appropriate adapter, and then also send that right through the firewall so you're ready to go with all your wiring in the cabin. The third sensor you're going to need to install is the speed sensor. Now, if you're using a factory Ford transfer case, Dakota Digital is going to include this part for you that just simply bolts into the transfer case right here, making for a simple install. Then you're just going to simply use the rest of the wiring harness that Dakota Digital has given you, and that will also adapt right into your gauge. Now it's time to choose a mounting location for your Dakota Digital box. For this particular application, I chose where the factory cruise control module was originally mounted, but you can put it anywhere you want to. You just want to make sure it's something that you can access in case you need to make a change later on. A couple notes for my particular installation is because I'm running a diesel engine, I also need to use an SGI 100BT tax signal box, and I'm also going to be using Dakota Digital's GPS box for this particular installation. So the speed sensor that I just showed you will not be used for this particular application. Now that my box has been mounted, we're going to go into the actual wiring, and you will see that it is not that difficult to do. Dakota Digital on page 5 is going to give you a layout of all the sensors and all the wires that need to go for your particular installation, and everyone's going to potentially be different. So your installation may vary compared to mine, but overall it's going to generally be the same, and obviously make changes for what you're doing in particular. Okay, let's start with the main wires for our installation today. So our first wire that we have is the ground to the box, and you can see this right here. And this particular ground I have going all the way down to an external fuse box that I'm running for this particular application, and that fuse box is directly grounded to both the chassis, the body, and the engine to make sure that I always have a good ground. Next up, we're going to need a 12-volt constant. I used a nice gauge wire, although you don't need to be that big with the gauge. And that, again, I am running to an external fuse box that I'm using for this particular application, given all the extra accessories that I'm installing on this truck. Now, if you're doing a factory Ford truck setup, you're probably best to fuse that wire and run it straight to the constant power side of the starter solenoid. That's probably the easiest way to do it. You don't need to worry about doing it like that. Ford did that for the camper special and the trailer special option. So as long as you have a fuse in there somewhere of about 10 amps or maybe even just 5, you'll be just fine doing that particular installation. That brings us to our third main wire for the harness, and that is going to be the accessory key on power wire. Now, you need to be careful here. You do not want it to be a key on run only power. You want it to be a true key on power source. So what I did for this particular installation is I tapped in right at the ignition solenoid right here. And the only reason I did it all the way over at this spot is because a previous owner had already put a tap there. So instead of repairing that wire and moving it closer to the box, I just retained that tap that the previous owner had. But regardless, just use a light probe, put the key on, and just make sure that you found a key on, engine off power source, and you will be good for that particular installation. Again, you're probably going to want to put a fuse on that just to be safe, and that's exactly what I did, just to make sure that there wouldn't be any issues going into the box. Now let's go to our next wire, and that is going to be the tack wire. And you can see Dakota Digital labels them very clear, and it's very plain to see. Depending on your application, if you're running an MSD box on your Ford engine, then obviously that's going to be the tack wire for the MSD box. For my particular installation, I'm running the external box, so I'm taking the sensor from the crank and I'm converting it through this box and I'm sending it back up to the Dakota Digital box. So again, you're going to have to make decisions for your own installation and decide what works best for you. Next up, we have the speed input, and you can see that right here. Ground, signal, and power. It's not really that complicated. Same thing for the temperature, ground and signal. And then again, for your pressure input, you're going to have ground, signal, power, and then this bare wire goes right here where it says DRN. And that is going to conclude your signals that you need for that particular portion. Very plain to see, very easy to see. Next up, we're going to go into our instrument cluster wires that we need to install. Now, each wire is going to have either a ground and a signal, or it's potentially just going to have a signal, and that is it. Let's start with the fuel input. We need to have a ground, a dedicated ground, and we also need to have the signal. So I ran the ground all the way down to my ground source, which you can see right here on my dedicated external fuse panel. And then the other wire is going to go over to where the instrument cluster would originally plug in. Now, I didn't want to completely destroy this harness, so what I did was I just taped off the end, and then I used taps to tap into all my signals. Now, what you want to do is you want to go in online and just look up what are the what are the harness numbers for your instrument cluster, and you're going to tap in from that location. So for the fuel signal, I tapped into 15 on the cluster because that is the correct wire for my fuel signal. And then I ran that back to the box, and there you go. You can see right here. Now next would be your high beam, your left, and your right. So I went over to my cluster and I ran those numbers as such, and you can see they are tapped in right here into my original cluster. So again, just find out the pin readouts for all of these numbers and you will be good to go. Next up, you need to run the switch input wire, which is right here, and that particular switch is what's going to control your gauges for setting the miles per hour or running through the gauges and changing the settings and everything else. And you're going to want to eventually mount this underneath your dash like so it's easily accessible. Next up, you're going to have the display cable, and this display cable is going to plug right into the box, and then it's going to go to your gauges, which we're going to plug in here in a second. There are other things that you can also add to this, which I have not. You can do a clock. If you're running maybe like a Coyote engine and you want to have a check engine light, you could put that in. If you want to have a brake warning signal, you can do that. There's tons of different things here, a 4x4 light, a gear readout, there's lots of things. Dome light adjust, you have to make those decisions on your own on what you want to include for your particular installation. But let's get the gauges plugged in and see what they look like here. Okay, so now we have our gauge cluster, and again, this is the RTX brand, which I think is by far Dakota Digital's best looking. I like to put these in all my vehicles. So for this particular application, it's very simple. We just have one plug in the back and then a second plug if you want to add the buzzer. All right, now I'm going to turn the key on and hopefully our gauges will light up. And there you go. You can see we have our gauges ready to go. Let's turn the lights on and see if they work. Okay, so when I powered up the unit for the first time, and that was truly the first time I powered it up, I realized it was not going into night mode, and I forgot that I was still making a decision on whether or not I wanted to run the optional dimmer switch for the lights. So at least temporarily, what I did was I tapped into the headlight switch right here, which was the headlight switch on only power, and then I ran that all the way up to the dim right here in the box, and now my headlights should go on, or it should transition into night mode when I turn my headlights on the Dakota Digital. So let's see here. Yep, and there we go. So now we're in dim mode. Let me turn the lights off and see how it looks. Okay, wow, that's really awesome. What a cool looking set of gauges. I can't wait to get this going in this truck. It's really going to make a huge difference. You have a clock, you have all the other gauges that you need. Way easier with the coolant temperature gauge because you get an actual number on it. Everything about this is just so much better. Obviously a tachometer as well, which is huge. So don't be afraid of doing this installation on your Dakota Digital gauges. It's really not that hard to do. It could probably be done in a couple hours, even if you're taking your time, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less if you're rushing. But it's a very easy install, and it's definitely a huge upgrade compared to the factory truck. So if you liked this episode of Dentside Depot, remember to like and subscribe, and keep restoring those classic trucks.